Hi, I'm Rodney Johnson with Informed American. I'm here with David Stockman. You might know him as his time as the budget director for Ronald Reagan back in the day. Lately, he has done a lot of things in between, of course, but now he is writing Deep State Declassified, something you can find and read with a lot of great insight and intel. And we're going to ask you a couple of questions. You are clearly on record as hating everything about the government. I think that's a pretty fair statement. And it includes the direction that we've taken in Congress and in the administration, right? And so let's put that into a bucket and say we already know that we don't like where it's going because we're not being responsible. The question is, what would you do, right? After analysis, you need prescription. And so if you could be president for a day, what would you do?
Well, I'll tell you, I would work day and night until we reformed the charter of the Fed.
Okay.
That reform would include abolishing the open market committee. We don't need these guys intervening and meddling in the market every day, trying to micromanage interest rates to the last 2 decimal points. I would make it illegal for the Fed to hold government debt.
Okay.
If it wants to buy securities, it should buy good paper from businesses that produce real things. And if you did that and abolished the Humphrey-Hawkins Act and these ridiculous mandates to pursue inflation that no one can really even measure, let alone 2%, which is dumb in a world where we're competing with labor at $5 an hour in China. We're supposed to keep inflating ours at 2% year after year. That's dumb. We're in a global economy. A central bank in the United States cannot drive our growth rate or our unemployment rate if you could measure it correctly, which you can't. So get them out of the way of private capitalism. Let the free market work. Let the financial markets rediscover price discovery, honest price discovery between supply and demand of people that have money, real money at risk, and not a market that's dominated by a monetary politburo, 12 people who have no skin in the game, sitting there pontificating about where they think the economy is going, and they have no clue because they never can predict anything correctly. And let the market work. That's the beauty of capitalism. And my final point on this is that if you take the whole structure of a 21 trillion economy or a 82 trillion worldwide economy, the heart of it is capital markets. And you can't mess with capital markets. You've got to let price discovery work, supply and demand work. You can't have government agents in the middle of these capital markets falsifying prices, repressing interest rates, boosting the stock market, goosing the stock market, and all the other things they do. Because if capital markets work, capitalism works. If capital markets have been totally dominated by government bureaucrats, capitalism is in trouble.
So, but we don't exist in a vacuum.
Right.
And so the Federal Reserve, of course, comes into being in 1913. They're supposed to be the lender of last resort against good assets.
Right.
That went out the window in the 20s, which we know. And they became the people who are supposed to tame the business cycle.
Right.
They've done a pretty terrible job of that, if that's their job, right? And the idea that they can control 2 toggles, interest rates and currency, and with that make unemployment low and make prices moderate and interest rates even is idiotic. But still, they do serve a purpose only as much as we're playing defense against like the European Union with the ECB, not as much Japan, but it is still, the BOJ is a force. And so if the Fed wasn't pursuing these things, would we then have a tremendous amount of flow of capital in and out that might otherwise hurt business? Or do you think that the market would take care of that too?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. Your diagnosis is spot on.
Well, we are the informed American. We try to be informed.
Yes. But the thing is, the biggest export the United States has had in the last 35 years is bad monetary policy. It all started with Greenspan. We can go back, 1988, the Bundesbank was not in the sub-zero rate business, okay? The Bank of England was more or less behaving itself, and even the Bank of Japan at that time had not yet gone off the deep end. In other words, because of what the Fed has done, flooding the global financial system with unwanted dollar liabilities, it's basically induced all the other central banks of the world to copy and paste.
So they're playing defense
in
to
order,
us.
because their politicians say you can't allow our exchange rate to go up,
Exactly.
which it would,
Exactly.
because that'll hurt our export industries. It's, the mercantilism. The Fed is exported, and here's the heart of it, bad money and bad mercantilist policy. Everybody else became mercantilists in the world. The oil producers of the Persian Gulf, link their currencies to ours, which means they inflate theirs as fast as we inflate ours. The ECB obviously is in the business of trying to, race us to the bottom, and they've gotten even below the, surface with negative rates, which is totally absurd. So if the Fed stopped, and if we reformed our monetary system, our central banking, to that original purpose that you talked about, providing liquidity as a last resort for good collateral at a penalty rate of interest.
At a dear price.
That's exactly, and actually Carter Glass, the author of the Federal Reserve Act in 2013, that's what he believed. People forget that when the Fed was created, it was illegal to buy government debt. The only thing that the Fed could do was take collateral, which reflected short-term bills or even finished inventory. That was good collateral that the Fed, the regional banks, all 12 of them, could advance cash into the banking system. And so therefore, there was no macroeconomic mandate. There was no Humphrey Hawkins. They didn't know from the unemployment rate, and they don't still now, by the way. And so that might have worked tolerably, but then it got hijacked in 1917 by the need to finance World War I, which is a huge mistake. And we were off to the races, because once you get the central bank in the business of buying government debt, that's monetization. No matter how you want to, define it away, as they're constantly doing it, trying to do at the Fed, it's monetization. It's buying real assets that represented the consumption of real resources with fiat credit plucked from thin air. And you do it a little bit, maybe it's not so bad. You do it a little bit over a long period of time, maybe it's not so bad. You do it massively and in a short period of time, like the central banks have done. And I talked about this the other day. Our balance sheet of all the central banks of the world following the Fed, forcing everyone else, you can see it in the layers on a little chart I had, went from $4 trillion of combined balance sheet in 2003 to 26 trillion at the peak about a year ago. Now that's 22 trillion of firepower injected into the capital markets of the world and the money markets. It obviously bought a huge amount of stuff: government debt, corporate debt, junk bonds. In Japan, ETFs, Swiss Bank is the biggest, one of the biggest holders of Apple stock, just to give you a flavor for this. And when you buy that much stuff, not with savings that come out of the existing economy, but with
new money,
made up money, new money, you're going to distort the pricing of everything, and in a big way. Now, you have all these people doing studies. If you can imagine anything more wasteful than the Fed, which is making all these arbitrage profits anyway, paying economists to study whether or not the $4 trillion worth of debt they bought and the $22 trillion all the banks bought affected the bond market yields. I mean, how stupid is that? $22 trillion doesn't affect supply and demand.
They could have just asked savers. They would have told them. It's been an effect.
Oh, no, they also say that there's a surplus of savings in the world. Give me a break.
And so that brings up a good point. After one of the Fed meetings when Bernanke was chair of the Fed, somebody asked him, and I can't remember which reporter it was, said, well, what do you say to savers? Because clearly you have moved interest rates near zero and long-term rates near, at that time, 3%. What do you say to them? And he said, well, clearly they're not earning what they did before on these safe assets, but the economy is so much better, they're better off in general, which is a cold comfort to somebody who has CDs and that was their main source of income. What do you think interest rates would be, not on the short end, because clearly there's some different things to go into that, but what do you think 30-year interest rates would be if the Fed, central banks around the world following the Fed, if the central banks were not involved? I mean, and people, just to set this up some, I don't know what the readers know. You were in private equity. You've been in the capital markets for a long time. I mean, people jump, as I did at the beginning, from Reagan to now, but you lived a life since then.
Yeah.
And so you have a financial background. So in your educated opinion, where would we be?
Well, at the moment, the drift of inflation, if you measure it, all these measures aren't any good, but the one I like is called the 16% trimmed mean CPI. And what they do is it's the same old CPI that you normally see, but every month they take out the 8% lowest changes and the 8% highest, takes the volatility out of it, but it's not like CPI less food and energy, because
food and energy are still good, right? I need those things.
So this thing is just a more stable measure of where the price level is going. It's been 1.98% since January 2012, when the Fed went into formal inflation targeting. And they say they can't make their target. Okay. Now my point is, if inflation is 2%, there should be 2 to 3% real yield on top of that for the 10-year bond, the benchmark.
Right.
So we should be at a 5% level, not at 1.5 on the Treasury, 10-year where it is today, or at practically zero for most of the other sovereigns in the world, or below zero for much. Now, we're at the point, this has got so absurd that somebody needs to be, grabbed by the collar and shaken up and, taken to the woodshed or something at the Fed. And the ECB in particular, Greece issued debt this week at a negative yield.
Greece.
Now, Greece,
it makes no
sense. If you need any symbol of an economic and fiscal basket case in the world, their debt is still 180% to GDP. That's the government. Their economy is still drastically smaller than it was 8 or 10 years ago. You could go on and on. That is a country that is going to default on its debt.
When it starts repaying. They're not even supposed to be repaying right now, and they still can't get out of their own way.
No, but the next time we have another recession in the world, there is going to be one. They're going to default, and you have all of these traders and pontificators in the financial market saying, well, this is just part of the whole new monetary regime, and trying to come up with an excuse about why you would pay the government of Greece to borrow money from you. That's how absurd it is. Just think it through, and it tells you that, it's not that the Fed is a little behind the curve or a lot behind the curve. It's that the whole central banking system of the world is out to lunch, and it's not going to end well.
So let's change gears. As last question here, we're heading into, of course, the election cycle. Some say we never left the election cycle. What do you see? I mean, we've got Biden and Warren and, arguably Bernie Sanders, although he seems to be kind of flailing and trailing at this point. And President Trump on the other side is not really running a campaign against Sanford or Walsh or Weld. And so it looks like it's Trump versus someone. What do you think is going to happen?
Well, I think we're looking at the Elizabeth Warren Express coming down the pike at an accelerating speed. The Democrats in the House, in their wisdom, basically threw Biden under the bus when they raised this whole impeachment gate thing and Ukraine gate thing.
Put the spotlight right on him.
By the time they get done with all this, because remember, the Republican investigation and dirt finding machine, what they call Oppo research, is pretty good. They're going to find it all. He's done. Okay. Bernie had his stents, implanted the other day. It's a reminder that he's pushing 80, and he's only got 10% base in the Democratic electorate. Anyway, he's done. I think he's done. The field is clear. In other words, the stents are put in, as a medical matter to open up the arteries, right?
Right.
What happened is the Democratic primary got stented last week, and it was opened up. For the field has been opened wide for Elizabeth Warren, and she's running on the wealth maldistribution that results from bubble finance by these central banks over many, many years. The whole thing they're doing is driving up the price of financial assets, inflating financial assets to a fairly well. It's not helping Main Street. Everybody out there knows that. That's why Trump got elected last time. But she's figured out the Democrats have always made a mistake by saying we're going to raise income tax rates on the wealthy, the soak the rich, because there are 95 million people that pay income taxes, and they don't believe politicians, and they say, if you're going to raise taxes, you're going to raise them on me too, and I don't want anything to do with that. But when Elizabeth Warren says, I'm going to put a wealth tax on 50 million and above net worth, everybody in America knows they don't have a net worth of 50 million.
Right.
That there's 600 billionaires all together. That's it. Let's soak them. Let's tax them hard. There's 83,000 households in America out of 130 million, a total tiny fraction, 0.5, that have net worths of over 50 million and would get the 2% tax. So she has really figured out. It's a horrible policy. Don't mistake.
I'm not saying that her having it makes it a good policy.
It's a good idea. I mean, it's going to destroy whatever's left of capitalism, but it's going to be a winning. It's going to be a winning platform, especially if Trump finally and the Fed together and all the other central banks of the world stumble into pricking this bubble, and I think it's likely. And if the bubble breaks in the stock market and Trump's embraced the big fat ugly bubble at 2,900 that he chastised at 2,100.
Yep.
And if the bubble breaks, we know now that the order of stock market and recession has been inverted. It used to be as the economy got weak, then the stock market would buckle.
Suit, right.
Today, it's when the bubbles, these giant bubbles that are being inflated by the central banks, finally break. As they do, implode violently, like in 2000, like in 2008. It causes panic in the C-suites of corporate America. And they see their stock prices plummeting. They see their stock options evaporating, and they just do desperate things. They fire anybody they can find hanging around the water cooler. They start writing off assets left and right. They have huge restructuring plans. They begin to liquidate inventory. You could see it last time when we had the Great Recession in the winter of 2008, 2009. They were throwing 800,000 people overboard a month.
Right.
They liquidated 10 or 12% of their inventories. This is what causes the recession shock now. It emanates from Wall Street when the bubble breaks. So the risk going forward is the bubble breaks, the recession incepts in 2020. I think it's highly likely. We're long overdue. We're long overdue. After all, we're in month 124 of this expansion. We're at record territory already. And when that happens, and Elizabeth Warren has consolidated the nomination, I think well before the end of this year, then you're likely to have a President Pocahontas.
There you go. You heard it here. David, thank you for your time.